The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning, and Eleanor already knew what the voice on the other end would say. She had been expecting this call for 3 weeks. Her father had been failing slowly, his body surrendering one system at a time, and the hospice nurse had warned her that the end was approaching. Still, when the words came through the receiver, they landed like stones dropped into still water. Your father passed peacefully at 6:15 this morning. He was not in pain. I am so sorry for your loss. Eleanor stood in her kitchen, holding the phone against her ear, watching the morning light spread across the marble countertops of a house that had never quite felt like home. Behind her, she could hear her husband moving around upstairs, getting ready for another day at the firm he had built over 30 years. The firm they had built together, though no one remembered that part anymore. Martin. Eleanor's voice came out smaller than she intended. Martin, my father is gone. She heard his footsteps pause on the landing above. A moment of silence stretched between them, and in that silence, Eleanor felt the distance that had been growing for years. Oh, sweetheart. I am so sorry. His voice floated down the stairs, carrying the appropriate concern. What time did it happen? Just now. About half an hour ago. I need to go to the hospice. There are arrangements to make. Of course. Of course you do. Martin appeared at the top of the stairs, already dressed in one of his tailored suits, his silver hair perfectly in place. He looked at her with an expression she had once mistaken for love. Do you need me to come with you? And there it was. The question that was not really a question. The offer that was not really an offer. Eleanor had learned to hear the difference over the years. No. She heard herself say it calmly, as if from a great distance. No, you have that presentation today. The Morrison Project. You have been preparing for weeks. Relief flickered across Martin's face, so quickly that she might have imagined it. Are you sure? I can reschedule if you need me. I am sure. Go to work, Martin. I will handle things with my father. He came down the stairs and kissed her forehead with the practiced tenderness of a man performing a familiar ritual. Call me if you need anything at all. I mean that. I know you do. She watched him gather his briefcase and his keys. She watched him pause at the door, turn back as if to say something more, and then simply nod and leave. His car started in the driveway. The garage door opened and closed. And Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 23 years, realizing that she had just lost the only person in the world who truly saw her. Welcome back to another powerful story, my beloved listeners. Kindly tell where you're watching from and what time it is where you're at. If you're new here, prepare for a story of betrayal, unexpected love, and what truly makes a family. Drop everything and listen closely. This tale of heartbreak and redemption might just change how you view love and family forever. The funeral was small, held at the church overlooking the bay where Eleanor's father had lived for the last 40 years of his life. Henry Waverly had been a quiet man, a former engineer who preferred the company of books and the sound of the ocean to the noise of social gatherings. His friends were few but loyal, and they stood in a solemn row as the pastor spoke words that seemed too generic for a man who had been so specifically, quietly remarkable. Martin attended, of course. He stood beside Eleanor in the front pew, his hand resting on her back in a gesture of support that she had stopped expecting to feel genuine. He shook hands with the mourners afterward and said all the right things about what a fine man Henry had been. He did not mention that he had seen Henry only twice in the past 5 years. He did not mention the coolness that had developed between them, the way Henry's eyes had followed Martin at family gatherings with an expression Eleanor had never quite been able to read. After the reception, after the last of the casseroles had been delivered and the last of the sympathetic hands had been shaken, Eleanor drove to her father's cottage alone. Martin had a dinner meeting with clients that could not be rescheduled. Important potential investors. The firm's future depended on it. Of course it did. The firm's future had been depending on something for 30 years. Eleanor let herself into the cottage with the key she had carried since childhood. The house smelled like her father. Old books and pipe tobacco and the salt air that drifted through the windows he always left cracked open, even in winter. She walked through the rooms slowly, touching objects that held decades of memory. The armchair where he read. The desk where he had worked long into the night on projects she never fully understood. The photograph on the mantel of Eleanor's mother, dead now for 15 years, smiling at the camera with the same patient eyes Eleanor saw in her own reflection. On the kitchen counter, she found a small stack of mail that had accumulated during her father's final weeks in hospice. Bills, mostly. A few sympathy cards that had arrived early. And one letter in a cream-colored envelope, bearing the return address of Pemberton and Associates, attorneys at law. Eleanor set the letter aside. She was too tired to deal with legal matters tonight. Tomorrow, or the next day, she would begin the process of closing out her father's modest estate. The cottage would need to be cleaned and sold. The old fishing boat in the yard had not been in the water for 15 years. His savings account held enough to cover his final expenses with perhaps a little left over. It was not much to show for 83 years of life, but Henry Waverly had never cared much about accumulation. He had cared about his daughter. He had cared about the view of the bay. He had cared about living simply and honestly. Eleanor wished, not for the first time, that she had inherited more of his clarity. She drove home that night through empty streets, the letter from Pemberton and Associates sitting unopened on the passenger seat beside her. Martin was still at his dinner meeting when she arrived. She placed the letter on the kitchen counter, poured herself a glass of wine she did not really want, and sat in the dark living room until exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep. The letter remained unopened for 3 days. During those 3 days, Eleanor moved through her life like a woman underwater. She cleaned the house that did not need cleaning. She prepared meals that Martin ate absently while scrolling through emails on his phone. She answered condolence calls with appropriate gratitude and declined offers of company with the excuse that she needed time alone to process her grief. What she was actually processing was something she could not have named if asked. A feeling that had been building for years, surfacing now in the wake of her father's death like something long submerged finally breaking the waterline. She felt invisible. She had felt invisible for a very long time. On the 3rd day, Martin called in the early evening to say he would be working late. A crisis with the Morrison project. Some calculations that needed to be reviewed before the morning presentation. He was sorry, truly sorry, but this was important. Of course, Eleanor said into the phone. Do what you need to do. She hung up and looked at the letter still sitting on the counter, now partially buried under grocery receipts and the day's mail. Something about Martin's easy lies, delivered with the confidence of long practice, made her reach for the envelope and finally break the seal. What she found inside did not make sense at first. The letter was from Arthur Pemberton himself, the senior partner of the firm that had handled her father's affairs for as long as Eleanor could remember. The language was formal, as legal correspondence always is, but there was something personal in the phrasing that suggested Arthur had known Henry well. Dear Mrs. Grant, the letter began. I am writing to inform you of your inheritance following the death of your father, Henry James Waverly. As per his explicit instructions, the enclosed documents detail the full scope of his estate and the conditions under which these assets are to be transferred to your sole ownership. Eleanor turned to the next page, expecting to see the cottage listed, perhaps the boat, the modest savings account she knew about. Instead, she found herself looking at a number that could not possibly be correct. $14,700,000. She read it again. And again. Her hands had begun to shake without her noticing. The documents that followed told a story Eleanor had never known. Her father, quiet Henry Waverly, who wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation and drove a truck older than some of his grandchildren would have been if Eleanor had ever had children, had been sitting on a fortune for decades. It had started with mineral rights. Land that had been in the family for 4 generations. Coastal property that Eleanor had always assumed was worthless scrub. Her grandfather had acquired the mineral rights before the value of such things was understood, and Henry had held onto them out of sentiment more than strategy. 30 years ago, an energy company had approached him about leasing those rights. Henry had agreed, on terms that the company probably regretted now, and had been collecting royalty payments ever since. He had never mentioned any of this to Eleanor. He had never spent the money in any visible way. He had simply let it accumulate in accounts and investments that he managed quietly, living the same modest life he had always lived, watching the bay from his cottage window, asking nothing from anyone. But he had been watching. That much was clear from the additional documents in the envelope. There were notes in Henry's handwriting, instructions he had left for the attorneys about how the inheritance should be structured. Everything was held in trusts that predated Eleanor's marriage to Martin. The assets were specifically protected from any claim a spouse might make. There were requirements for independent legal counsel before any funds could be released. And there was a separate letter, handwritten, addressed to Eleanor alone. My dear girl, It began. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are learning things I should have told you long ago. I hope you will forgive an old man his silence. I have watched your marriage for many years. I have seen things that troubled me, patterns that reminded me of cautionary tales I heard from my own mother about men who charm and diminish in equal measure. I could not prove anything. I did not want to interfere in your life with suspicions that might have been nothing more than a father's overprotective instincts. But I could protect you in other ways. Everything I have left you is structured so that it belongs to you alone. No matter what happens in your marriage, no matter what you discover about the man you chose to spend your life with, these resources are yours. They cannot be touched by anyone but you. I hope I am wrong about Martin. I hope you never need the protection I have built for you. But if I am right, Eleanor, I want you to know that you are not trapped. You have options. You have always had more strength than you know. I love you. I have always loved you. And I am sorry I could not find the words to tell you these things while I was alive to see your face. Your father. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table for a very long time after she finished reading, the letter trembling in her hands. Her father had known. Somehow, without proof, without evidence, operating on nothing but instinct and careful observation, Henry Waverly had known that something was wrong in his daughter's marriage. And instead of confronting her with suspicions she might have denied, he had simply built walls around her future. Walls she had not known existed until this moment. The question now was whether those walls were necessary. Eleanor looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 9:47. Martin was supposedly still at the office, reviewing calculations for the Morrison project. She picked up her phone and dialed the main number for Grant Architecture, the firm that bore her husband's name and had been built, in its earliest days, with the labor of her own hands. Thank you for calling Grant Architecture. A recorded voice answered on the second ring. Our offices are currently closed. Business hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Please leave a message and we will return your call on the next business day. Eleanor ended the call without leaving a message. She dialed Martin's direct extension. 4 rings, then voicemail. She dialed his cell phone. It went straight to recording, which meant it had been turned off. For a long moment, Eleanor sat perfectly still, holding the phone in one hand and her father's letter in the other. The house around her was silent. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked and fell quiet. Then she opened her laptop and began to search. She was not sure what she was looking for. Evidence of something. Confirmation of the suspicions her father had harbored for years. Suspicions she had refused to let herself examine because examining them would have meant questioning everything she had built her life around. But Eleanor had worked in that architecture firm for 15 years before Martin suggested she focus on the home. She had balanced the books, managed the accounts, learned the rhythms of how money moved through the business. She understood the systems even if she had not accessed them in 2 decades. It took her 3 hours to find the first discrepancy. A property downtown, purchased 18 months ago through a limited liability company that was not connected to any project she knew about. The purchase price had been funded by transfers from the firm's operating accounts. Transfers that were large enough to require board approval, though Eleanor found no record of any such approval in the public filings. She kept searching. More transfers. More properties. A pattern of money movement that suggested someone was systematically extracting funds from the firm and routing them through a maze of shell companies. At midnight, Martin's car pulled into the driveway. Eleanor heard the garage door open and close, heard his footsteps in the hallway, heard him call out a quiet greeting as he moved toward the kitchen. She closed her laptop and waited. There you are. Martin appeared in the doorway, looking tired but satisfied. Long night. But I think we have the Morrison project locked down. That is wonderful. Eleanor heard her own voice, calm and neutral. How did the calculations review go? Tedious but necessary. You know how it is. Martin crossed to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of water. Or maybe you do not remember. It has been a long time since you were involved with that side of things. It has been, Eleanor agreed. A very long time. Martin drank his water and talked about the presentation scheduled for the morning, about the clients who would be attending, about the future of the firm that now bore only his name. Eleanor listened and nodded in appropriate places and watched his face as he spoke. She was looking for something. Some tell, some flicker of deception, some evidence that the man standing in front of her was not who he had always claimed to be. She found nothing. Martin was too practiced for that. But she remembered something her father had written in his letter. Patterns that reminded me of cautionary tales. And she thought about the property downtown, the shell companies, the money that had been moving for 18 months at least. Eleanor went to bed that night lying beside a man she no longer trusted, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing slow into sleep. In the morning, she would begin making phone calls. The law offices of Pemberton and Associates occupied the top floor of a building in the city center, 3 hours from the house Eleanor shared with Martin. She told him she was going to meet with her father's attorneys to discuss the estate. This was technically true. She did not tell him that she had asked Arthur Pemberton to arrange a meeting with someone else as well. A specialist whose name had appeared in her father's files, referenced in correspondence dating back 12 years. Margaret Chen was 68 years old, with steel-grey hair and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. She specialized in complex divorces, particularly those involving financial abuse and hidden assets. She had built her career on helping women escape marriages that had been designed as traps. Eleanor's father had retained her services 12 years ago. Just in case. Mrs. Grant. Margaret rose to shake Eleanor's hand when she entered the conference room. I am deeply sorry for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man. Thank you. Eleanor took the seat Margaret indicated, a leather chair positioned facing the windows and the city skyline beyond. I am still trying to understand just how remarkable. That is understandable. He kept many things private. Margaret settled into her own chair and opened a folder that Eleanor could see was thick with documents. But he was meticulous in his preparation. When he came to me 12 years ago, he had already been observing your husband for some time. He had concerns. What kind of concerns? Margaret's expression was careful, measured. He noticed patterns of behavior at family gatherings. The way your husband spoke to you. The way he took credit for achievements that had been collaborative. The way your voice seemed to disappear when Martin entered a room. Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. She had not realized anyone had been watching. She had not realized those patterns were visible to anyone but herself. He also noticed, Margaret continued, that you seemed unaware of your own diminishment. Or perhaps unwilling to see it. He did not blame you for this. He understood that these things happen gradually, over years, in marriages that begin with genuine love. They did begin with genuine love. Eleanor heard herself say it, though she was no longer certain it was true. At least, I believed they did. I am sure you did. Margaret's voice held no judgment, only a kind of weary recognition. That is how these situations work. The man you married may have genuinely cared for you in the beginning. Or he may have been performing from the start. Either way, the result is the same. You gave more than you received. Your contributions were erased. Your identity was slowly absorbed into his. Eleanor thought about the early years of the marriage, when she and Martin had worked side by side in a converted garage, building a business from nothing. She had typed every proposal. She had balanced every ledger. She had charmed the clients whose contracts kept them solvent during the lean times. And somewhere along the way, all of that had been forgotten. By Martin. By the firm. By Eleanor herself. My father hired an investigator, Eleanor said. I found references to it in his files. 8 years ago. Yes. Margaret nodded slowly. He wanted to know if his suspicions were correct. He was not certain, you understand. He only had instincts and observations. But he loved you enough to seek the truth, even knowing what he might find. What did he find? Margaret was quiet for a moment, and in that silence Eleanor heard the answer before the words were spoken. Evidence of an affair. A colleague at your husband's firm. It lasted approximately 14 months before ending. Your father considered telling you at the time. Ultimately, he decided that you needed to reach your own conclusions in your own time. Eleanor closed her eyes. 8 years ago. She tried to remember what her life had been like 8 years ago. What Martin had been like. Whether there had been signs she had missed or chosen not to see. There had been signs. She realized that now. Late nights that seemed excessive. A new attention to his appearance. A period when he had been distant, distracted, followed by a sudden renewal of affection that she had gratefully accepted without questioning. She had not wanted to question. That was the truth of it. She had built her entire adult life around this marriage, and questioning would have meant confronting the possibility that all of it had been built on sand. My father never said anything to me. Her voice came out rough. All those years, and he never said a word. He loved you. Margaret said it simply, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. He wanted you to be happy. He hoped the affair was an aberration, something your husband would not repeat. He chose to protect you rather than force you to face something you might not be ready to face. But he prepared for the possibility that I would need to face it eventually. Yes. He prepared very carefully. Margaret gestured to the folder in front of her. Everything he documented is here. The investigation from 8 years ago. Additional observations he made over the years. Correspondence with me about how to structure his estate to protect you. He built walls around your future, Mrs. Grant. Whatever happens in your marriage, those walls will hold. Eleanor reached for the folder with hands that were not quite steady. She spent the next hour reading through her father's meticulous records, each page adding new weight to the realization that was settling into her bones. Henry Waverly had seen the truth about Martin for more than a decade. He had watched his daughter being slowly erased from her own life, and he had been unable to stop it without potentially destroying her. So instead, he had prepared a safety net. He had hired attorneys and investigators. He had structured his estate to be untouchable. He had done everything in his power to ensure that when Eleanor finally opened her eyes, she would have options. The question now was what she intended to do with those options. I need to know what is currently happening, Eleanor said when she finished reading. Not 8 years ago. Now. I need to know if my husband is still deceiving me. Margaret nodded as if she had expected this. I can recommend an investigator. The same one your father used. He is discreet and thorough. There is something else. Eleanor met Margaret's eyes directly. I found financial irregularities last night. Money moving through the firm in ways that do not match any projects I know about. Properties purchased through shell companies. If my husband has been embezzling from his own firm, that changes things. It changes a great deal. Margaret's expression sharpened with professional interest. Do you have documentation? Some. Enough to know there is more to find. I worked in that firm for 15 years. I know how the systems work, even if I have not accessed them in a long time. Then I suggest we bring in a forensic accountant. Someone who can trace the money properly and document everything in a way that will hold up in court. Margaret made a note in the margin of her legal pad. Mrs. Grant, I need to ask you a direct question. What outcome are you hoping for here? Eleanor considered the question carefully. A week ago, she would not have been able to answer it. A week ago, she had still been the woman who accepted her husband's lies because questioning them was too painful to contemplate. But something had changed when she read her father's letter. Something had shifted when she understood that Henry had seen the truth all along, had loved her enough to prepare for this moment, had believed in her strength even when she did not believe in it herself. I want to know the truth, Eleanor said finally. All of it. And then I want to make sure my husband faces the consequences of his choices. Margaret Chen smiled, and it was not an entirely pleasant smile. Then we have work to do. The investigator's name was Samuel Webb, and he had the kind of face that seemed designed to be forgotten. Unremarkable features, average height, the sort of man who could sit in any restaurant or walk down any street without drawing a second glance. This, Eleanor learned, was precisely what made him good at his job. Within a week, Samuel had confirmed what Eleanor's father had suspected and what Eleanor had begun to discover on her own. Martin was conducting an affair with a junior partner at his firm, a woman named Victoria Crane who was 26 years younger than Eleanor and who believed, based on the messages Samuel intercepted, that she was going to become the next Mrs. Grant. The affair had been going on for approximately 2 years. During that time, Martin had purchased a condominium downtown, registered in both his name and Victoria's. He had taken her on vacations to places Eleanor had never visited. He had bought her jewelry and clothes using a credit card that was billed to an account Eleanor had never seen. And he had, according to text messages that Samuel documented, discussed Eleanor with a contempt that made her physically ill to read. She barely exists. One message read. I do not know why I married her in the first place. She had potential once, but she has turned into furniture. Something you forget is even in the room. Eleanor read that message sitting alone in her father's cottage, having driven there after receiving Samuel's first report. She read it 3 times, each time feeling something different. First, devastation. Then fury. And finally, a strange cold clarity that felt almost like relief. She had not imagined it. The distance, the dismissal, the way she had felt herself disappearing over the years. It had not been in her head. Martin had been actively erasing her, treating her with contempt behind closed doors while performing the role of devoted husband in public. But there was more. Samuel's investigation had uncovered additional affairs in the past. The one Eleanor's father knew about, from 8 years ago. Another before that, with a client whose project had mysteriously been transferred to a different architect when the relationship ended. And suggestions of others, hints and traces that Samuel was still pursuing. Martin Grant had been systematically unfaithful for most of their marriage. And each time, he had managed to end the affairs cleanly, moving on to the next conquest without Eleanor ever suspecting. Until now. The financial investigation was equally damning. The forensic accountant Margaret hired, a methodical woman named Patricia Okonkwo, spent 3 weeks tracing the flow of money through Martin's various shell companies. What she found was a 15-year pattern of embezzlement, with over $4 million diverted from the firm's accounts into Martin's personal holdings. He has been very careful, Patricia explained during a meeting at Margaret's office. The amounts are large enough to matter but small enough to escape casual notice. He routes them through legitimate-seeming expenses, marks them as consulting fees or equipment purchases, then transfers them through multiple entities before they end up in his personal accounts. Would the other partners have known? Eleanor asked. Some of them must have suspected. Patricia's expression was neutral, professional. But your husband is the senior partner. He has been with the firm since its founding. Questioning him would have required someone willing to challenge his authority, and from what I have seen of the firm's culture, that kind of challenge is not encouraged. Eleanor thought about the firm events she had attended over the years. The deference with which the younger architects treated Martin. The way his word was treated as law in matters of design and business alike. He had cultivated that authority deliberately, she realized now. He had made himself untouchable because being untouchable meant being unaccountable. There was one more discovery, and it was the one that finally crystallized Eleanor's resolve. He has been preparing divorce papers, Margaret told her during their 4th meeting. Drafted quietly, through an attorney I had to dig to find. He has been planning to divorce you for approximately 18 months. The timeline matched the beginning of his affair with Victoria. Eleanor absorbed this information with the strange calm that had become her constant companion over the past weeks. What do the papers say? They propose a division of assets that would leave you with very little. Martin has been systematically restructuring the marital finances to make it appear that you have contributed nothing to the marriage. He would keep the house, the investment accounts, his share of the firm. You would receive a modest settlement and be expected to sign a confidentiality agreement preventing you from discussing the terms. He was planning to throw me away, Eleanor said. After 30 years. After everything I did to help build that firm. He was going to give me nothing and expect me to stay quiet about it. That appears to be his plan. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. But Mrs. Grant, his plan was based on the assumption that you would not discover it. It was based on the assumption that you would sign whatever papers he put in front of you, grateful for any settlement he offered. It was based on the assumption that you are exactly who he believes you to be. And who does he believe I am? Someone who barely exists. Margaret quoted the text message deliberately. Someone who has turned into furniture. Someone who will not fight back because she does not believe she has any power. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the city skyline her husband's firm had helped to shape. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Martin was sitting in his office, confident in his deceptions, certain that his wife suspected nothing. He was wrong. He has no idea about my father's estate, Eleanor said finally. No idea about the money. No. Your father was very careful to keep that information private. And the estate is structured so that Martin has no legal claim to any of it, regardless of how long you have been married or what happens in the divorce. So he thinks I am poor. He thinks I am powerless. He thinks he can discard me and walk away clean. That is exactly what he thinks. Eleanor turned back to face Margaret, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was something colder, sharper. Then I believe it is time we showed him how wrong he is. The next 3 months were the most difficult of Eleanor's life. She returned to the house she shared with Martin and resumed her role as the invisible wife. She cooked his meals. She asked about his day. She listened to his lies with expressions of appropriate interest and concern. And every night, after he fell asleep beside her, she lay awake cataloguing his deceptions. There were so many of them. Small lies woven through every conversation. Invented meetings and fabricated emergencies. Phone calls he took in another room, his voice dropping to a murmur Eleanor could hear but not understand. She became an expert in the art of concealment. She learned to hide her knowledge behind the same pleasant expression she had worn for 30 years. She learned to respond to his casual cruelties without flinching. She learned to touch him without revulsion, to say the words he expected to hear, to perform the role of devoted wife while planning his destruction. It was exhausting. Some nights, she drove to her father's cottage just to sit in silence, away from the weight of pretense. She would stand at the window overlooking the bay and think about Henry Waverly, about the years he had spent watching his daughter disappear into a marriage that was consuming her. He had wanted to help. He had wanted to tell her the truth. But he had also known that Eleanor needed to find her own way to this moment. That she needed to choose strength for herself, not have it forced upon her. She understood that now. She understood so many things now. During those 3 months, Margaret Chen's team continued building the case. Patricia Okonkwo documented every financial irregularity, creating a paper trail that could be followed by prosecutors. Samuel Webb tracked Martin's movements, photographing his meetings with Victoria, recording conversations that revealed the depth of his contempt for Eleanor. And Margaret herself prepared the legal strategy that would bring everything crashing down. "We have evidence of embezzlement that could result in criminal charges," Margaret explained during one of their weekly meetings. "The state licensing board will certainly be interested. And the firm's other partners may choose to take action once they understand the scope of what has been happening." What about Victoria? She is complicit in some of the financial impropriety. There are transfers that went through her accounts, expenses she approved that were clearly fraudulent. Whether she understood what she was participating in is unclear, but ignorance may not protect her. Eleanor thought about Victoria. The confident smile. The proprietary way she stood near Martin at firm events. The certainty that she was winning, that she had claimed something valuable from another woman. "She does not know," Eleanor said slowly. "Victoria does not know she is just the latest in a long line. She thinks she is special. Most of them think they are special." Margaret's voice held the weariness of someone who had seen this pattern many times. They believe the lies because they want to believe them. And by the time they understand the truth, they are often in too deep to escape. There was a strange kind of sympathy in that observation. Victoria was a predator. Yes. She had knowingly entered a relationship with a married man, had plotted with him to discard his wife, had accepted jewelry and property and promises without questioning what her participation cost someone else. But she was also being deceived. Martin had told her the same lies he told every woman. That his marriage was loveless. That his wife was cold and distant. That Victoria was the only one who truly understood him. When the truth came out, Victoria would discover that she had built her future on quicksand. And while Eleanor could not bring herself to feel sorry for the woman who had been sleeping with her husband, she could recognize that they were both victims of the same predator. "The plan," Margaret said, "is to coordinate everything. The criminal complaints. The licensing board investigation. The divorce filing. We want it all to happen simultaneously, so there is no opportunity for damage control." When? 3 weeks from now. The quarterly board meeting at the firm. Your husband will be expecting a routine presentation of financial results. Instead, he will be facing federal investigators and state licensing officials. "And me. And you." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "You will be there as a major shareholder. Your father's trust includes a 12% stake in Grant Architecture. You have every right to attend board meetings." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest. For 30 years, she had been invisible in that firm. First as a worker whose contributions were forgotten. Then as a spouse whose presence was tolerated but not valued. She had stood in the background at events, smiled for photographs, made conversation with clients who had no idea she had once balanced the very books they were celebrating. Now she would walk into that boardroom and watch Martin's world collapse. What happens after? Eleanor asked. After the meeting. After the arrest. That depends on you. Margaret leaned forward slightly. The criminal charges will proceed regardless of what you decide. The evidence is too clear to ignore. But the divorce can unfold in different ways. You could pursue maximum financial damages. You could seek a quiet settlement. You could make this as public or as private as you wish. I do not want to be quiet. Eleanor heard herself say it and knew it was true. I have been quiet for 30 years. I have let my voice be erased. My contributions forgotten. My entire identity absorbed into his. Then we will not be quiet. Margaret's smile was thin but genuine. We will make sure everyone knows exactly who Martin Grant really is. Eleanor drove home that night through familiar streets that looked different now. The house at the end of the driveway was not her home anymore. It was a crime scene she was documenting. A stage where she performed a role she had never auditioned for. Martin was in the living room when she arrived, watching something on television with a drink in his hand. He looked up when she entered and smiled the smile he had been giving her for 3 decades. There you are. Where have you been? Just running errands. Eleanor set her purse on the table by the door. How was your day? Good. Productive. The Morrison project is really coming together. That is wonderful. She moved through the evening routine with practiced ease. Dinner. Conversation about nothing. The television murmuring in the background. Martin checking his phone periodically, probably exchanging messages with Victoria, probably planning their next meeting while Eleanor sat across the room pretending not to notice. At 10 o'clock, Martin announced he was going to bed. Early morning tomorrow. I will be up soon, Eleanor said. I just want to finish this chapter. She watched him climb the stairs, listened to the sounds of his nighttime routine, waited until the house fell silent. Then she pulled out her phone and sent a text to Margaret Chen. 3 weeks. I will be ready. The reply came within minutes. Good. Your father would be proud. Eleanor sat in the dark living room for a long time after that, thinking about pride and preparation and the weight of 30 years. She thought about the woman she had been when she married Martin. Young. Hopeful. Certain that she had found a partner who would value her for who she was. That woman had been wrong. But she had not deserved what happened to her. She had not deserved to be erased. And now, finally, Eleanor was going to make sure the man who had erased her understood exactly what he had lost. The morning of the board meeting arrived grey and cold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but refused to deliver it. Eleanor woke at 5, though she had barely slept at all. Martin was snoring softly beside her, peaceful in the certainty that today would be like every other day. He had no idea that his wife had been awake for hours, watching the ceiling, running through the sequence of events that would begin in just a few hours. She showered and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were professional but understated. Nothing that would draw attention before she was ready to be seen. She made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the light slowly change outside the window. At 6:30, Martin came downstairs, already in his suit, checking his phone as he walked. Big day, he said without looking up. The board meeting and then that dinner with the Morrison partners. I might be late tonight. Of course. Eleanor's voice was perfectly steady. Good luck with everything. Martin glanced up, his expression already distracted by whatever was on his screen. Thanks. Do you need anything while I am out? No. I have some errands to run today. I will manage. He nodded absently, poured himself a travel mug of coffee, and headed for the door. The same routine as 1,000 other mornings. The same casual dismissal. The same certainty that his wife would be waiting when he returned, invisible and compliant. Martin. He turned at the door, surprised to hear her say his name. Yes. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. This man she had married 30 years ago. This man who had promised to love and cherish her. This man who had spent most of their marriage breaking that promise in every way that mattered. Have a good day, she said finally. You too. He smiled, the same easy smile she had once loved. See you tonight. The door closed behind him. His car started in the driveway. And Eleanor sat alone at the kitchen table, counting down the hours until everything changed. At 8:45, Eleanor walked into the lobby of the building that housed Grant Architecture. She had been here many times over the years, but always as an accessory. Martin's wife. A pleasant presence at firm events. Someone to be greeted with polite smiles and immediately forgotten. Today, she walked through the lobby with Margaret Chen beside her and two representatives from the State Licensing Board behind them. She signed in at the reception desk, giving her name clearly. Eleanor Grant. Shareholder. The receptionist's expression flickered with confusion. Shareholder. My father left me his stake in the firm. Eleanor's voice was calm. I believe I am entitled to attend board meetings. The receptionist made a phone call, speaking in low tones that Eleanor could not quite hear. After a moment, she hung up and gestured toward the elevator. The boardroom is on the 15th floor. They are expecting you now. They were not expecting her at all, of course. But Eleanor simply nodded and walked toward the elevator, Margaret and the licensing officials following close behind. The ride to the 15th floor took 30 seconds. Long enough for Eleanor to notice that her hands were shaking slightly. Long enough for her to take a breath and steady herself. She thought about her father. About the letter he had left her. About the walls he had built around her future. She was not trapped. She had never been trapped. Henry Waverly had seen to that. The elevator doors opened onto a hallway lined with photographs of the firm's most prestigious projects. Buildings Eleanor remembered from their conception. Designs that had started as sketches on the drafting table in a converted garage 30 years ago. Her name appeared in none of the credit lines. Her contribution was acknowledged nowhere. But she had been there. She remembered every late night, every difficult client, every moment of doubt that she had helped Martin push through. That history was invisible now. But after today, everything would be different. The boardroom door was open. Eleanor could hear voices inside, the murmur of conversation that preceded every meeting. She paused at the threshold, and Margaret touched her arm lightly. Ready? Yes. Eleanor stepped through the door. The conversation stopped immediately. 12 faces turned toward her, some familiar, some not. She recognized the firm's partners, men and women she had known for decades. She saw the confusion in their expressions, the unspoken question. And then she saw Martin. He was standing at the head of the long conference table, a presentation remote in his hand, his face frozen in an expression she had never seen before. Surprise. Confusion. And beneath both of those, the first flicker of genuine fear. Eleanor. His voice cracked slightly on her name. What are you doing here? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly around the table, Margaret and the licensing officials following behind her. She took her time, letting the silence build, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. When she reached the empty seat near the head of the table, she sat down calmly and folded her hands in front of her. I am here, she said, because I am a shareholder. My father left me his stake in this firm. I believe that entitles me to attend this meeting. Martin's face went pale. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, one of the licensing board officials stepped forward. Mr. Grant, I am Robert Harrison from the State Board of Architecture. We need to speak with you regarding some irregularities in your professional practice. The next hour was methodical, devastating, and utterly thorough. Robert Harrison presented the initial findings from the licensing investigation. Financial irregularities, embezzlement from firm accounts, violations of professional ethics codes. Martin tried to interrupt several times, his voice rising with each attempt, but Harrison continued calmly, laying out the evidence piece by piece. Then Patricia Okonkwo took over, presenting the forensic accounting results. The shell companies, the hidden accounts, the $4 million that had been diverted over 15 years. Martin's colleagues sat in stunned silence. Some of them had suspected, Eleanor could see that in their faces. But suspecting was different from knowing. Different from seeing the evidence spread out in front of them, undeniable and damning. When Patricia finished, Margaret Chen stood to present the additional documentation. The prenuptial modification Martin had been preparing. The divorce strategy designed to leave Eleanor with nothing. The messages in which Martin had discussed his wife with contempt. She barely exists, Margaret read aloud, her voice flat and clinical. I do not know why I married her in the first place. She has turned into furniture. Something you forget is even in the room. The words hung in the air. Eleanor watched Martin's face as he heard them, watched him realize that she had read every message, that she knew exactly what he thought of her. His expression crumbled. The confident mask he had worn for 30 years finally cracked, revealing something smaller and more frightened underneath. Eleanor. His voice was barely a whisper. Let me explain. She stood up slowly, and the room fell absolutely silent. For 30 years, she said, I gave everything I had to this marriage. I typed your proposals. I balanced your books. I entertained your clients. I built the foundation of this firm with my own hands. She paused, letting the words settle. And in return, you erased me. You made me invisible. You took credit for my work and then suggested I focus on the home because I had earned it. You told other women that I barely exist. That I am furniture. Martin tried to speak, but Eleanor continued. My father saw what you were doing. He watched you diminish me year after year, and he could not stop it without destroying me in the process. So instead, he prepared. He made sure that when I finally opened my eyes, I would have options. Resources. The ability to walk away from you with my dignity intact. She looked around the table at the faces of Martin's colleagues. Partners who had enabled his behavior. Associates who had looked the other way. People who had benefited from Martin's brilliance while ignoring the cost of his cruelty. I am not here for revenge, Eleanor said. I am here because some debts must be paid. Because patterns of harm should be interrupted. Because the man you trusted to lead this firm has been lying to all of you, just as he was lying to me. She turned back to Martin, and for a long moment, they simply looked at each other. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of promises. 30 years of gradual destruction, finally laid bare. You thought you knew me, Eleanor said quietly. You thought I was too dull to notice. Too weak to fight back. Too much of nothing to matter. She paused. You were wrong. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Martin stood at the head of the table, his face grey, his hands trembling, the presentation remote still clutched in his fingers like a talisman against disaster. Eleanor waited for him to speak. She had imagined this moment many times over the past months. Had wondered what he would say when finally confronted with the truth. Whether he would deny, or justify, or plead. But when Martin finally found his voice, he said something she had not expected. Eleanor. His voice cracked on her name. I loved you. At the beginning, I really loved you. And despite everything, despite all the evidence and all the pain and all the carefully documented betrayals, Eleanor felt something twist in her chest at those words. Because she had loved him too. At the beginning. Before the erosion began. Before she started disappearing. I know, she said softly. That is what makes it worse. Martin's face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the young man she had married 30 years ago. Vulnerable. Uncertain. Almost human. Then Margaret Chen stepped forward. Mr. Grant, federal investigators are waiting in the lobby. They have some questions about the financial matters we have discussed today. I suggest you cooperate fully. The word federal seemed to break something in Martin. His legs gave way slightly, and he grabbed the edge of the conference table for support. Federal. His voice was hollow. You called the FBI. The evidence warranted it. Margaret's voice was neutral, professional. Embezzlement of this scale crosses multiple jurisdictional lines. Tax evasion. Wire fraud. These are serious matters. Martin looked around the room at his colleagues, his employees, the people who had respected and feared him for decades. They looked back with expressions ranging from shock to disgust to carefully maintained neutrality. None of them moved to help him. None of them spoke in his defense. He was alone. And finally, he understood what it felt like. Eleanor watched her husband being led from the boardroom by the federal investigators. She watched him stumble slightly at the door, watched him turn back as if to say something more, watched his mouth form her name without sound. Then the door closed behind him, and he was gone. The room remained silent for a long moment. Then the murmuring began. Questions and exclamations. The sounds of people processing the unimaginable. Margaret touched Eleanor's arm lightly. We should go. There will be more to discuss, but not here. Not today. Eleanor nodded. She gathered her things and walked toward the door, moving through the room full of people who had ignored her existence for years. At the threshold, she paused and looked back. The conference room was in chaos. Partners arguing. Associates whispering. Everything Martin had built beginning to crack and crumble. It was over. 30 years of being invisible, and it was finally over. Eleanor walked out of the building she had helped to build, leaving the ruins of her marriage behind her. But as she stepped into the grey morning light, she realized that something was still unresolved. A question that had been nagging at her since she first discovered the extent of Martin's betrayals. He had been planning to divorce her. He had been preparing for it for 18 months. He had drafted papers designed to leave her with nothing. But he had not filed those papers. He had not made his move. Even though he had Victoria, even though he had been plotting for over a year, something had stopped him from taking the final step. Why? What had he been waiting for? Eleanor stopped on the sidewalk outside the building, the question crystallizing in her mind with sudden terrible clarity. Margaret. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. The divorce papers Martin prepared. You said they were drafted 18 months ago. Yes. But he never filed them. No. What was he waiting for? Margaret's expression shifted, became careful. We assumed he was waiting for the right moment. For some advantage he had not yet secured. But there was something else. Eleanor felt the pieces connecting in her mind. He mentioned my father's estate. Before Dad died. He asked questions about whether there would be an inheritance. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Your father's health had been declining for some time. It was public knowledge that he was ill. So Martin was waiting. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. He was waiting for my father to die. He wanted to know what the inheritance would be before he made his move. The realization settled over her like ice water. Martin had not been planning to simply divorce her. He had been planning to divorce her after claiming a portion of whatever Henry Waverly left behind. He had been waiting to see what she was worth before discarding her. But there was more. Something Martin had said in one of the intercepted messages. Something Eleanor had read without fully understanding. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the files Margaret had shared with her. The documented conversations. The evidence of contempt. And there it was. A message from 6 months ago, sent to Victoria. Just need to wait a little longer. The old man is dying. Once the inheritance comes through and I get her to sign the new prenup, we are free. She will never even know what she lost. Eleanor stared at the words, understanding finally what her father had protected her from. Martin had known. Somehow, he had known that Henry Waverly was wealthier than he appeared. He had been positioning himself to claim a share of that wealth through marriage, then abandon Eleanor once the money was secured. But Henry had anticipated this. He had structured everything so that Martin could never touch it. The trusts. The protections. The careful legal walls. Her father had seen the trap being set, and he had dismantled it before Eleanor even knew it existed. He knew, Eleanor said aloud. My father knew exactly what Martin was planning. That is why he structured the estate the way he did. That is why he was so specific about independent legal counsel. Your father was a remarkable man. Margaret's voice was soft. He saw everything. And he made sure you would be protected when the time came. Eleanor looked up at the building where Martin was being questioned by federal investigators. Somewhere inside those walls, her husband of 30 years was finally facing the consequences of his choices. Everything he had plotted. Everything he had schemed. All of it collapsing around him. And he still did not know about the inheritance. He still did not know that Eleanor was worth more than he had ever imagined. He had spent 18 months waiting to claim her father's money, and he was going to prison without ever touching a cent of it. The irony was almost perfect. But as Eleanor stood on that grey morning sidewalk, watching her old life burn to the ground, she felt something besides satisfaction. Something besides the grim pleasure of justice finally served. She felt grief. Not for Martin. Not for the marriage that had been dying for years. But for the woman she had been. For the decades she had lost. For all the parts of herself she had surrendered, piece by piece, until she barely recognized her own reflection. She had been so young when she married him. So hopeful. So certain that love would be enough. It had not been enough. And now she had to figure out who she was without it. The rain finally began to fall, cold drops spattering on the sidewalk around her feet. "We should go," Margaret said gently. "There is still much to do. But the hardest part is over." Eleanor looked at her attorney, this woman who had been retained by her father 12 years ago just in case. This stranger who had become an ally. "Is it?" Eleanor asked. "Is the hardest part really over?" Margaret considered the question. "No," she admitted. "The hardest part comes next. Rebuilding. Finding yourself again. Learning to live without the structures you built your life around, even if those structures were prisons." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then I suppose I should get started." She began to walk, moving away from the building that held her husband and her past. The rain fell harder now, soaking through her coat, running down her face like tears she had not yet allowed herself to cry. Behind her, the doors of Grant Architecture remained closed. Whatever was happening inside those walls would continue without her. Ahead of her, the city stretched out grey and unfamiliar. A world she would have to learn to navigate alone. But she was not really alone. She carried her father with her. His foresight. His protection. His unshakable faith in her strength. And somewhere in the depths of her grief and anger and exhaustion, Eleanor felt something else beginning to stir. Hope. Faint and fragile, but unmistakably present. She had survived 30 years of being invisible. She had found the courage to open her eyes. She had watched her husband's empire collapse and remained standing. Whatever came next, she would face it. Not as Martin's wife. Not as someone who barely exists. But as Eleanor. Whoever that turned out to be. The cottage by the bay had been silent for 3 days when Eleanor finally allowed herself to cry. She had driven directly from the city after leaving the offices of Grant Architecture, her hand steady on the wheel, her mind carefully blank. She had stopped once for gas and coffee she did not drink. She had pulled into the gravel driveway of her father's cottage as the sun was setting, painting the water in shades of orange and gold that Henry Waverly would have loved. And then she had simply stopped. For 3 days, Eleanor moved through the small rooms like a ghost. She slept in her father's bed, wrapped in quilts that still carried traces of his scent. She ate mechanically, whatever she could find in the pantry, not tasting anything. She walked the shoreline at dawn and dusk, letting the cold wind scour her face, feeling nothing. On the 4th day, she found the photograph. It was tucked into a book on her father's nightstand, a slim volume of poetry that Henry had read aloud to her mother during the long years of her illness. The photograph showed Eleanor at 25, standing in front of the converted garage that had been the first office of Grant Architecture. She was smiling, her hair windblown, her eyes bright with the certainty that good things were coming. Martin had taken that photograph. She remembered the moment clearly. He had been laughing, telling her to hold still, telling her that someday they would look back at this picture and remember where it all began. She had believed him. She had believed everything he told her, back then. Eleanor sat on the edge of her father's bed, holding the photograph, and finally let the tears come. She cried for the woman in the picture, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what was coming. She cried for the decades of slow erosion, the gradual disappearance of everything she had thought she was. She cried for her father, who had watched it happen and been unable to stop it. She cried for the marriage she had mourned in silence for years, never allowing herself to acknowledge that it was already dead. She cried until there was nothing left, until the grief had emptied itself out and all that remained was a hollow clarity. Then she put the photograph back in the book, washed her face in cold water, and began the work of putting her life back together. The first call she made was to Margaret Chen. "I need to know what happens next," Eleanor said. "With Martin. With the firm. With everything." Margaret's voice was calm and professional, the same steady presence she had been throughout the ordeal. "The federal investigation is ongoing. Your husband has been released on bail, but the conditions are strict. He cannot leave the state. He cannot contact you. He cannot access any accounts that are under investigation." "What about the firm?" "The partners have called an emergency meeting for next week. They will need to decide how to proceed. Your husband's name is on the door, but given the circumstances, that may change. And the divorce? I have drafted the papers. Given the criminal investigation, Your husband's attorneys have advised him not to contest anything. He knows the evidence against him is overwhelming. The divorce should be finalized within 60 days. Eleanor absorbed this information slowly. 60 days. After 30 years, her marriage would be dissolved in 60 days. What about her? Eleanor asked. Victoria Crane. What happens to her? She has been terminated from the firm. Her involvement in some of the financial irregularities made her position untenable. Beyond that, I am not certain. She is not my client. But she is a victim too. Eleanor heard herself say it and was surprised to realize she meant it. Martin lied to her the same way he lied to me. She thought she was special. Perhaps. Margaret's voice was carefully neutral. But she also chose to pursue a relationship with a married man. She accepted gifts she knew were funded by his wife's ignorance. Whatever sympathy we might have for her position, she made choices that caused harm. I know. Eleanor looked out the window at the grey water of the bay. I just keep thinking about what happens next. For her. For all the women Martin used over the years. You have a generous heart, Mrs. Grant. Margaret's tone softened slightly. But right now, you need to focus on yourself. The rest will become clearer in time. After she hung up, Eleanor sat for a long while, thinking about Margaret's words. A generous heart. Was that what she had? Or was it simply the habit of putting others first, a pattern so deeply ingrained that she could not break it even now? She did not know. But she was going to find out. The weeks that followed were filled with legal meetings and financial reviews and the tedious mechanics of disentangling a 30-year life. Eleanor learned that Martin had been even more thorough in his deceptions than she had realized. He had forged her signature on documents. He had opened accounts in her name without her knowledge. He had used her identity to create layers of protection for his schemes, making her complicit in crimes she knew nothing about. Patricia Okonkwo, the forensic accountant, spent 3 weeks unraveling the full scope of his financial manipulation. He was very clever, Patricia told Eleanor during one of their meetings. Everything was designed to make you look like an active participant. If you had tried to divorce him without preparation, he would have used these documents to claim you were equally culpable. But I did not sign these things. Eleanor stared at the forged signatures, recognizing the shape of her name but not the hand that wrote it. I never even saw most of these accounts. I know. And we can prove that. The forensic analysis shows clear evidence of forgery. But if you had not discovered the truth when you did, if you had not had Margaret and your father's resources to support you, proving that would have been much more difficult. Eleanor thought about all the women who did not have fathers like Henry Waverly. Women who did not have $14 million in protected trusts. Women who faced men like Martin with nothing but their own desperate courage. What happens to women who cannot prove it? Eleanor asked quietly. Women who do not have the resources I have. Patricia was silent for a moment. Most of them lose, she said finally. They get labeled as bitter ex-wives. They get painted as liars or manipulators. They walk away with nothing because fighting would cost more than they could ever afford. That is not right. No. Patricia's voice was heavy. It is not right at all. That conversation stayed with Eleanor long after the meeting ended. It lingered as she drove back to the cottage. It echoed in her mind as she walked the shoreline at dusk. Most of them lose. She had won. But only because her father had spent 12 years preparing for this moment. Only because she had inherited resources that most women would never have access to. What about the others? What about the women who were still trapped, still invisible, still being slowly erased by men who saw them as obstacles to be removed? Eleanor did not have an answer. But she knew she could not simply walk away and pretend the question did not exist. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday in early December, exactly 53 days after Eleanor had walked into that boardroom. She did not attend the final hearing. Margaret handled everything, calling afterward with the details. It is done, Margaret said. You have been awarded the marital residence, though I understand you do not intend to return there. The investment accounts have been divided according to the forensic analysis of what was legitimately marital property versus what was obtained through fraud. Your husband retains only his personal effects and a small cash settlement. What about the firm? His share has been frozen pending the criminal proceedings. The other partners have voted to remove his name from the company. It will be known as Crane and Associates going forward. Eleanor absorbed this information with something that was not quite satisfaction. And the criminal case? Trial is scheduled for March. Given the evidence, his attorneys are encouraging him to accept a plea deal. If he does, he is looking at 3 to 5 years in federal prison. 3 to 5 years. Eleanor thought about all the years he had spent deceiving her. All the women he had used. All the damage he had caused. It did not seem like enough. But perhaps no punishment would ever seem like enough. There is one more thing, Margaret said. Your husband has requested permission to contact you. He says he wants to apologize. Eleanor felt something cold move through her chest. No, she said immediately. I do not want to hear his apologies. I thought you might say that. I have already informed his attorneys that any attempt to contact you will be considered a violation of the restraining order. Thank you, Mrs. Grant. Margaret's voice softened. Eleanor, you have handled this with remarkable grace. Many people in your position would have crumbled under the pressure. I want you to know that your father was right about you. You are stronger than you ever knew. Eleanor hung up the phone and sat for a long time in the silence of her father's cottage, thinking about strength. She did not feel strong. She felt hollowed out and exhausted, running on fumes and determination. She felt like a woman who had survived a war and was only now beginning to count the casualties. But she was still standing. That had to count for something. The news of Martin's arrest and the collapse of his reputation spread through their social circle like wildfire. Eleanor received phone calls from people she had not spoken to in years. Former colleagues. Old friends. Women who had attended the same charity events and dinner parties, who had smiled at her across crowded rooms while Martin held court. Some of them were genuine. They expressed shock and sympathy, asked how she was holding up, offered help they probably could not provide. Others were simply curious. They wanted details, gossip, the inside story of how a respected architect had turned out to be a fraud and a criminal. Eleanor stopped answering the phone after the first week. She let everything go to voicemail, deleting most messages without listening to them. But one message made her pause. Mrs. Grant, this is Diane Whitfield. We have never met, but I think we have something in common. I was involved with your husband about 8 years ago. I recently learned what has happened, and I wanted to reach out. If you are willing to talk, I would very much like to speak with you. My number is... Eleanor listened to the message 3 times before calling back. Diane Whitfield answered on the second ring. Mrs. Grant. Her voice was cautious, uncertain. Thank you for returning my call. I was not sure you would. Please call me Eleanor. And I was not sure either. But I think I need to hear what you have to say. They met at a small cafe in a town neither of them lived in, neutral territory for a conversation that would be difficult for both of them. Diane was in her late 40s, attractive in a subdued way, with a kind of careful composure that suggested she had learned to guard herself over the years. She was already seated when Eleanor arrived, a cup of tea cooling in front of her, her hands folded on the table. Thank you for coming, Diane said as Eleanor sat down. I know this must be strange. Strange is one word for it. Eleanor studied the woman who had been her husband's mistress. What made you reach out? Diane was quiet for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Guilt, she said finally. I have carried it for 8 years. When I saw the news about Martin, about everything that had come out, I could not stay silent anymore. What happened between you and my husband? And Diane told her story. It was painfully familiar. Martin had pursued her at the firm where she worked as a project coordinator. He had been charming, attentive, full of promises about a future together. He had told her that his marriage was loveless, that his wife was cold and distant, that he stayed only out of obligation. He said you did not understand him, Diane said, her voice tight. He said you were from different worlds. He made me feel like I was the only one who truly saw him. How long did it last? 14 months. And then one day, he simply ended it. No warning. No explanation. He called me into his office and said it was over. That he had made a mistake. That he was going to try to make things work with his wife. Eleanor felt a dull ache spreading through her chest. That must have been devastating. It was. Diane's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the severance agreement. He made me sign papers promising never to speak about our relationship. In exchange for a small payment and a letter of recommendation, I agreed to pretend it had never happened. He paid you to stay silent. Yes. And I took the money because I was ashamed. Because I did not want anyone to know what I had done. Because I believed him when he said it would be better for everyone if we just moved on. Eleanor thought about all the years she had been married to Martin, all the time she had felt something was wrong but could not identify the source. Diane's affair had been happening while Eleanor was planning their 20th anniversary party. While she was believing that her marriage was solid, even if imperfect. Did you ever consider telling me? Diane looked down at her tea. 1,000 times. But I convinced myself it would only cause more pain. That you were better off not knowing. That Martin had changed, that he was being a better husband now. She laughed bitterly. I was a fool. We both were. They sat in silence for a moment, two women connected by the same man's lies. There were others, Diane said finally. Other women before me. I found out later. Martin had a pattern. He would pursue women at the firm, make them feel special, use them until he was bored, and then discard them with severance agreements and confidentiality clauses. How many others? I do not know for certain. At least 2 that I could confirm. Probably more that I never learned about. Eleanor absorbed this information with the numb familiarity of someone who had already processed too many shocks to feel another one fully. And now there is Victoria, Eleanor said. The woman he was planning to leave me for. I saw her name in the news. Diane's expression was complicated. She is young. Ambitious. Probably convinced she was different from all the others. She probably was convinced of that. She will learn. Diane's voice was heavy. They always do. Eleanor looked at this woman who had been her husband's mistress 8 years ago, who had carried guilt and shame in silence all this time, who had finally found the courage to reach out. Why are you really here? Eleanor asked. What do you want from me? Diane was quiet for a long moment. I do not want anything, she said finally. I just wanted you to know that you are not alone. That what happened to you happened to others too. That Martin has been doing this for decades, and we all believed we were the only ones. She reached across the table and touched Eleanor's hand lightly. And I wanted to tell you that I am sorry. For my part in it. For staying silent. For letting you live with a man I knew was capable of such cruelty without ever warning you. Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she had shed since those 3 days in the cottage. You did not owe me a warning, she said. You were a victim too. We were all victims. Diane's grip tightened slightly. But maybe now, together, we can make sure there are no more. Eleanor thought about that conversation many times in the weeks that followed. Diane's words echoed in her mind as she continued the tedious work of rebuilding her life. We can make sure there are no more. It was a noble sentiment. But how? Martin was facing criminal charges. His reputation was destroyed. He would never work in architecture again, would probably spend years in prison. What more could Eleanor do? The answer came to her on a cold morning in January, as she stood at the window of her father's cottage watching the grey waves crash against the shore. She could use her resources. The $14 million her father had left her. The connections she had made through Margaret Chen and Patricia Okonkwo. The legal expertise and investigative capabilities that had helped her escape her own trap. She could help other women do the same. The idea took shape slowly, growing clearer as Eleanor spent hours researching and planning. She read about organizations that helped women escape abusive marriages. She learned about the legal barriers that made it difficult for women to leave. She discovered how many of them walked away with nothing because they could not afford to fight. And she began to see a path forward. It would not be enough to simply donate money, though she intended to do that too. She wanted to create something more substantial. A foundation. A network of lawyers and accountants and investigators who could help women escape situations like the one she had been in. Women who were being erased. Women who were being financially controlled. Women who felt invisible and powerless and trapped. Women who needed walls built around their futures, the way Henry Waverly had built walls around hers. She called Margaret Chen on a Tuesday morning in late January. I want to start a foundation, Eleanor said without preamble. I want to use my father's money to help women escape abusive marriages. Margaret was quiet for a moment. That is an ambitious goal, she said carefully. The legal and financial complexities of what you are describing would be significant. I know. But I also know that there are women right now going through what I went through. Women who do not have $14 million in protected trusts. Women who are being slowly erased by men who see them as obstacles. I want to help them. What kind of help are you envisioning? Legal representation. Forensic accounting. Private investigation when necessary. Eleanor felt the idea crystallizing as she spoke. Everything I had access to, that made it possible for me to escape. I want to make that available to women who cannot afford it on their own. Margaret was silent for a long moment. Eleanor, she said finally, your father would be very proud. They spent the next month setting up the infrastructure. Margaret brought in specialists in non-profit law. Patricia recommended accountants who could help structure the financial systems. Samuel Webb, the investigator who had documented Martin's betrayals, agreed to serve as a consultant. Eleanor named it the Waverly Foundation, after her father. The mission statement was simple: to provide comprehensive support for women escaping financially abusive marriages. Legal representation. Financial analysis. Investigative services. Whatever was needed to help them leave with their dignity and resources intact. The first client came to them in early March, just as Martin's trial was beginning. Her name was Margaret Sullivan. She was 54 years old. And her story was painfully familiar. My husband controls everything, Margaret Sullivan said, sitting across from Eleanor in the small office the foundation had rented downtown. The bank accounts are in his name. The house is in his name. The cars. The investments. After 31 years of marriage, I do not have a single asset that I can prove is mine. Eleanor studied the woman in front of her. She saw the defeat in Margaret Sullivan's posture. The resignation in her eyes. The way she spoke about her situation as if it were inevitable, unchangeable. She recognized all of it. She had been that woman, not so long ago. Tell me everything, Eleanor said. From the beginning. And Margaret Sullivan talked. For 2 hours, she poured out the story of her marriage. The gradual accumulation of control. The slow erosion of her independence. The way her husband had made her feel grateful for things that should have been her right. He tells me I should be thankful, Margaret Sullivan said. That without him, I would have nothing. And the worst part is, I have started to believe it. Eleanor reached across the table and took the other woman's hands. That is exactly what he wants you to believe, she said. That is how men like him keep control. They make you feel like you do not deserve anything, like you should be grateful for the crumbs they give you. But I have no proof. No documentation. No way to show that I contributed anything to this marriage. That is where we come in. Eleanor squeezed her hands gently. We have forensic accountants who can trace the flow of money through your marriage. We have investigators who can document your husband's assets. We have lawyers who know how to fight for what you deserve. She leaned forward, holding Margaret Sullivan's gaze. You are not invisible, she said. You have just been told you are. And we are going to help you see the truth. The Waverly Foundation took on Margaret Sullivan's case. Within 6 weeks, Patricia Okonkwo had traced over $2 million in assets that Margaret Sullivan's husband had hidden from her. Within 3 months, the divorce was finalized, and Margaret Sullivan walked away with half of everything. She was not the last. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. Women began reaching out to the foundation. Some had stories similar to Eleanor's. Others had faced different kinds of abuse. All of them had been made to feel invisible, powerless, trapped. The foundation helped as many as it could. Some cases were simple. Others were complex, requiring months of investigation and legal maneuvering. But every woman who walked through their doors received the same message. You are not alone. You are not invisible. You deserve to be seen. Eleanor threw herself into the work with a focus that surprised even herself. She attended meetings, reviewed cases, met with clients. She spent hours on the phone with lawyers and accountants, pushing for better outcomes, demanding more thorough investigations. For the first time in 30 years, she felt like she was doing something that mattered. Something that was entirely her own. Martin's trial ended in April with a conviction on multiple counts of embezzlement, tax evasion, and fraud. Eleanor did not attend the trial. She followed the proceedings through Margaret Chen's reports and the occasional news article. She learned that Martin had finally accepted a plea deal, acknowledging his guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. 4 years in federal prison. Restitution to the firm's partners. Permanent revocation of his architectural license. When the sentence was announced, Eleanor was in a meeting with a new client, a woman named Teresa who had discovered that her husband had been hiding income for 15 years. She excused herself briefly to check her phone, read the news alert, and then returned to the meeting. "Is everything all right?" Teresa asked. "Yes." Eleanor smiled slightly. "Just some old business being resolved." Now, where were we? She did not think about Martin again for the rest of the day. There was too much work to do. But that night, driving back to the cottage through the darkness, she allowed herself to feel something. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just a quiet recognition that the chapter was finally closed. Martin was in prison. The firm that bore his name had erased him. The woman he had planned to leave her for had been exposed and disgraced. Everything he had built, everything he had schemed and manipulated and lied to create, was gone. And Eleanor was still standing. Stronger than she had ever been. Doing work that mattered. Living a life that was entirely her own. It was not the ending she had imagined when she married Martin 30 years ago. But perhaps it was a better one. Spring arrived slowly on the bay, the grey water gradually warming, the bare trees beginning to show hints of green. Eleanor had settled into a rhythm at the cottage. She woke early, walked the shoreline, then drove to the city for foundation work. She returned in the evenings to the quiet rooms where her father had lived, eating simple meals, reading from his library of books, watching the sun set over the water. She was not lonely, exactly, but she was alone. And for the first time in her adult life, she was learning to be comfortable with that. One evening in late April, she received an unexpected phone call. "Mrs. Grant." The voice was female, young, uncertain. "This is Victoria Crane." Eleanor felt her breath catch. "How did you get this number?" "Your foundation has a website. The contact information is public." Victoria's voice was trembling slightly. "I know I should not be calling you. I know you probably hate me. But I did not know who else to talk to." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, processing the strangeness of this call. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize." The words came out in a rush. "I know it does not change anything. I know what I did was wrong. But I need you to know that I did not understand. I believed him when he said your marriage was over. I believed him when he said you did not care about him anymore. I believed everything. You believed what you wanted to believe." "I know." Victoria's voice broke. "I know that now. But at the time, it seemed so real. He made me feel like I was the only person who truly understood him. Like everyone else in his life was just going through the motions. But with me, he could be his real self." Eleanor thought about Diane Whitfield, saying almost exactly the same words. "You were not the first," Eleanor said quietly. "There were others before you. He used the same approach every time. I found that out." Victoria was crying now. Eleanor could hear it in her voice. "After everything came out, I started talking to people. Women who had worked at the firm years ago. Some of them told me stories about Martin. About relationships he had ended the same way he ended theirs. Did that make you feel better or worse?" "Both." Victoria laughed bitterly. "Better because at least I was not uniquely stupid. Worse because I helped him hurt you without ever questioning whether his story was true." Eleanor looked out the window at the darkening bay. She thought about all the anger she had carried. All the betrayal and pain and loss. And she thought about the foundation. About the work she was doing now. About the women she was helping to escape situations just like hers. "What are you going to do now?" Eleanor asked. "I do not know." Victoria's voice was small. "I cannot work in architecture anymore. Not in this city. Maybe not anywhere. My reputation is destroyed. My career is over. Everything I worked for is gone. Welcome to the club." There was a long silence. Is that why you started the foundation? Victoria finally asked. To help women like us? Not like us. Eleanor corrected her gently. Women who cannot fight back on their own. Women who do not have resources or connections or anyone in their corner. That is who the foundation helps. Oh. But Victoria. Eleanor heard herself say the name, still strange on her tongue. If you want to do something useful with your life, you could volunteer. We always need people who understand how these situations work from the inside. You would let me help? After everything? Eleanor thought about her father. About his patience. About the way he had protected her without forcing her to confront things she was not ready to face. People can change, she said. I did. Maybe you can too. The call ended with Victoria promising to think about it, to consider whether she could face the women whose situations she had once been complicit in creating. Eleanor did not know if she would ever hear from Victoria again. But the conversation had shifted something inside her. For months, she had been carrying anger toward the woman who had helped destroy her marriage. Victoria had been a convenient target for all the pain Eleanor could not direct at Martin. But the truth was more complicated. Victoria was a victim too, manipulated by the same man, used and discarded the same way all the others had been. Her crime had been believing lies that Eleanor herself had believed for 30 years. Perhaps forgiveness was not the right word. But something like understanding was beginning to take root. The one-year anniversary of Henry Waverly's death fell on a perfect May morning, the sky cloudless, the water of the bay calm and blue. Eleanor drove to the small cemetery overlooking the shore, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers from the garden her father had tended for 40 years. The groundskeeper nodded as she passed, recognizing her from the visits she had made throughout the year. She walked slowly up the hill to where her father was buried beside her mother. The headstone was simple, just their names and dates and a single line of inscription that Eleanor had chosen. He built what could not be taken. She stood before the grave for a long time, not speaking, not needing to. So much had changed since the last time she stood here. She had discovered the truth about her marriage. She had watched her husband's world collapse. She had rebuilt her own life from the wreckage, piece by piece. And she had started something new. Something that mattered. I did it, Dad, she finally said aloud. I found out the truth. And instead of breaking, I got stronger. The wind rustled through the grass around her. I understand now why you did not tell me. Why you protected me without forcing me to see what I was not ready to see. You knew I needed to reach my own conclusions. To find my own strength. She touched the headstone gently. Thank you for building those walls. For giving me options. For believing in me even when I did not believe in myself. She placed the wildflowers on the grave and stepped back. The foundation is helping people. Really helping them. Women who were trapped like I was. Women who felt invisible. We are showing them that they deserve to be seen. Eleanor looked out over the bay, at the water that had witnessed her father's entire life, at the shore where she had played as a child, at the horizon that seemed to promise endless possibilities. I miss you, she said softly. Every day, I miss you. But I also know you are still with me. In the work I am doing. In the person I have become. She stood at the grave until the sun began to warm her shoulders, until the morning light had fully claimed the day. Then she turned and walked back down the hill toward her car. There was work to do. There was always more work to do. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor felt equal to the task. The Waverly Foundation had been operating for 9 months when Eleanor received a letter that stopped her heart. It was handwritten, addressed to her personally, sent from the Federal Correctional Facility where Martin was serving his sentence. The envelope had been opened and resealed by prison officials, inspected for contraband. Eleanor stared at the letter for a long time before opening it. She thought about calling Margaret, asking for advice, maybe even turning it over to the authorities without reading it. But in the end, curiosity won. Eleanor, the letter began. I do not expect you to read this. I do not deserve your attention after everything I did. But I need to try to explain, even if explaining is impossible. I loved you. At the beginning, I truly loved you. You were smart and capable and you believed in me when no one else did. Those early years, building the firm together, they were the happiest of my life. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I started to believe my own success was something I had achieved alone. I forgot that you were the foundation everything else was built on. And once I started forgetting, it became easier to keep forgetting. To rewrite the story so that I was the hero and you were just a supporting character. The affairs were wrong. I know that now. I knew it then, too, though I convinced myself they did not matter. That you would never find out. That what you did not know could not hurt you. I was wrong about everything. I saw the news about your foundation. About the women you are helping. And I realized something that should have been obvious years ago. You were never invisible. You were the strongest person in the room. I was just too blind to see it. I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I do not deserve it, and you have no reason to give it. I am writing because I needed you to know that I understand, finally, what I destroyed. What I threw away. What I lost. I am sorry, Eleanor. For all of it. For everything. I hope you have found peace. I hope the work you are doing brings you the fulfillment I could never give you. I hope you know that somewhere, in a cell he richly deserves, there is a man who finally understands how wrong he was. Martin. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. She waited for anger. For the surge of bitterness she had carried for so long. For the impulse to tear the paper into pieces and throw it away. But none of that came. Instead, she felt something unexpected. Pity. Martin had spent his entire adult life chasing success and admiration, and the approval of people whose opinions did not matter. He had sacrificed his marriage, his integrity, his freedom, all for a version of himself that had never been real. And now he was sitting in a prison cell, writing letters to the woman he had betrayed, finally understanding what he had lost. It was not justice. Justice had been served in the courtroom. This was something else. Something sadder. This was consequence. Eleanor folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with the other documents from her old life. She did not plan to respond. There was nothing left to say. But she also did not throw it away. It was part of her story now. Part of the journey that had brought her to where she was. And where she was, finally, was exactly where she belonged. Summer settled over the bay with long golden evenings and warm salt breezes that carried the scent of the ocean through the open windows of the cottage. Eleanor had stopped thinking of it as her father's cottage. It was hers now, filled with her books, her photographs, her growing collection of art from local artists she had discovered at the small gallery in town. The foundation was thriving. They had helped 43 women in their first year of operation. Some cases had ended in divorce. Others had resulted in criminal charges against abusive husbands. All of them had ended with women walking away with their dignity intact and resources to build new lives. Victoria Crane had surprised everyone by actually showing up to volunteer. She worked quietly, making phone calls, organizing files, doing the unglamorous work that kept the foundation running. She never spoke about Martin or her past with Eleanor, and Eleanor never asked. It was an arrangement that worked. Diane Whitfield had become a regular presence as well, using her experience to counsel women who were just beginning to understand what had been done to them. She had a gift for listening, for making people feel heard, for helping them see that they were not alone. The foundation had become a kind of family. Damaged people helping other damaged people find their way back to themselves. On a warm evening in late July, Eleanor sat on the porch of her cottage watching the sunset paint the water in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the year that had passed. The discovery. The devastation. The slow, painful work of rebuilding. She thought about her father, who had seen the truth long before she was ready to see it herself. Who had built walls around her future and trusted her to find her way to them when the time was right. She thought about Martin, sitting in his prison cell, finally understanding what he had lost. And about Victoria, trying to make amends for choices she could not undo. She thought about the 43 women whose lives the foundation had changed, and the hundreds more who would come to them in the years ahead. Most of all, she thought about herself. About the woman she had been and the woman she had become. For 30 years, she had let herself be invisible. She had accepted her erasure as the price of love, not understanding that it was actually the destruction of love. But she was not invisible anymore. She was seen now, by herself and by others. She mattered. Her work mattered. Her life mattered. That was enough. More than enough. The sun slipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with purple and gold. The first stars began to appear over the water. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the bay her father had loved. "Thank you," she said softly to no one in particular. "For everything." Then she turned and went inside to make dinner, humming a tune she remembered from childhood, feeling something she had almost forgotten was possible. Peace. Real peace, hard-won and irreversible. The kind that comes only after you have walked through fire and discovered that you are still standing on the other side. Eleanor Grant had survived. And she was never going to let anyone make her invisible again.